Why did they think silence meant weakness? At Fort Cinder, laughter had a way of carrying in the dry desert air, sharp and cruel like broken glass rattling across the sand. It was the kind of laughter that didn't fade quickly. It stayed. It burned. And on that afternoon it was directed at one woman, Specialist. She hadn't spoken a word. Not when the swaggering private stepped forward. Not when his multi-tool snapped through the cracked leather belt at her waist. Not even when the halves of it fell to the dust like shed skin, leaving her uniform loose, exposed, ridiculous. The recruits waited. They expected something, anger, tears, a report straight to the colonel. But only Crouched picked up the severed belt and held it in one hand. Her eyes, unreadable and still, touched briefly on Private, then she walked away. Not hurried, not cowed, just gone. Their laughter faltered. It didn't stop right away. It stumbled, lost its rhythm, and finally died in the heavy, baking silence of the Mojave. What none of them knew, what not even herself had fully decided in that moment, was that the prank wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. Fort Cinder was the kind of place that stripped a person bare. A handful of weathered buildings pressed into a stretch of desert that didn't know mercy. Heat by day, cold by night, wind that scoured the paint off metal and the patience out of men. The base wasn't for glory. It wasn't even for war. It was for breaking people down and seeing what remained when the fragments were reassembled. Into this crucible walked. Her arrival wasn't worth a headline. She carried a single duffel bag slung across her shoulder, her frame small, almost swallowed by the horizon. Her uniform was crisp, but the fabric seemed too big on her. Her dark hair was pulled back in a bun that tugged at her temples, making her look severe, almost cold. The colonel's office didn't notice her. The recruits didn't salute her. To them, she was nothing but another clerk in the logistics depot, filed somewhere between ammunition crates and ration boxes. In the military lexicon, she was a REMF, a re-echelon expletive, somebody whose war was fought behind paperwork, not rifles, somebody who existed so the real soldiers didn't have to think about fuel lines and spare parts. She moved through her new life without complaint. She logged shipments, tracked manifests, ticked boxes. Her handwriting was neat, her workspace immaculate, her hours long. No personal photos, no trinkets, not even a coffee mug with a slogan, just order. Stark, disciplined order. But there was one thing out of place, one thing that didn't match the checklist. Her belt. It wasn't nylon like everyone else. It was leather, dark and cracked with age, brass buckle dulled by time. It had the look of something carried too far, through too much. The belt bothered them. Maybe because it was old, maybe because it wasn't regulation, or maybe because, in the unspoken language of soldiers, it carried weight they couldn't decipher. Whatever the reason, it was enough. Enough for the recruits to notice. Enough for to make a spectacle. A week after her arrival, crossed the dusty stretch between depot and mess hall. Bravo Company had just been dragged through the obstacle course, sweat slick and cocky, riding the high of survival. Their laughter spilled out before them. Blocked her path, his shoulders filling the sun. "Well, look what we've got," he said, voice thick with drawl. "The supply clerk." Stopped, she didn't answer. Her silence irritated him, and he leaned closer, eyes dropping to the leather around her waist. "What's with the antique? Lose your issued gear." Another recruit snickered. "Looks like something my granddad wore to church." Still said nothing. Her stillness pulled at like gravity. So he acted, quick, deliberate, cruel. The pliers snapped, the leather parted, and laughter burst like gunfire. The fragments of her belt lay in the dirt. She bent, collected them, and stood. Her eyes, two shards of ice, met for the briefest instant. No anger, no fear, just silence. Then she walked away. The laughter faltered, and though none of them would admit it, something else had slipped in. A kind of unease. The same kind you felt when the desert wind stopped suddenly, leaving the air too still, too heavy, like something was about to happen. Colonel heard about the incident days later. Not from she filed no complaint, no report. It came through gossip, the kind that slithered from private to NCO until it landed, sanitized and neutered on his polished desk. An interpersonal conflict between recruits and a logistics specialist. Scowled, he hated personnel issues. They distracted from the mission. Soldiers should break obstacles, not each other. He summoned her. When stepped into his office, she looked even smaller against the mahogany and the flags. She stood still, hands clasped behind her back, face expressionless. "I have a report," began, his voice sharp. "It says you were harassed, your property destroyed, and you did nothing. Why?" "There is nothing to be gained, Colonel." Her answer was calm. Leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Discipline is to be gained. Respect is to be gained. You let them walk all over you and you send a message that support staff are weak. Why didn't you put them in their place?" His face didn't flicker. He reached for her file. He had read it twice already, but he flipped through again. Joint Special Operations Command Support Element, Fort, restructured, lateral transfer, no commendations, no promotions. "You were shuffled here," said flatly. "Washed up, a paper pusher. This base doesn't need ghosts. It needs clerks who count bullets and stay out of trouble. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," crystal clear. There was no defiance in her tone, no submission either, just fact. "Dismissed." She turned, executed a perfect about-face, and left. The door clicked shut, quiet as her footsteps. And who had expected weakness, expected excuses, was left staring at the closed door with a dissatisfaction he couldn't name. He had dismissed her, but why did it feel like she had measured him instead? Life in the depot continued. Crates, manifests, numbers, but something in shifted. Dismissal wasn't failure, it was permission. She became a ghost in the routines of Fort Cinder. On breaks, she sat behind the depot, field manual open in her lap. To the casual eye, she was reading, but her eyes followed Bravo Company across the drill square. She watched. She saw his haymaker, the way he dropped his guard after throwing it. Saw another's sloppy footwork, another's habit of leaning too far into a block. She learned their rhythms, their tells, their weaknesses. At night in her barracks room, she stitched her belt back together, not delicately, not to make it beautiful, to make it stronger. The thick, ugly scar of thread ran across the leather like a wound that refused to break again. In the mornings she wore it, not as a defiance, not as a relic, as proof. A thing could be cut in half and still be whole. The recruits saw only a clerk, saw only silence. Colonel saw only a problem shuffled into his command. But saw them, all of them, and in the stillness of the desert nights she waited. Because silence wasn't weakness. It was patience. And patience had teeth. Why did the Colonel's words sting less than the silence that followed? Walked out of Colonel's office with her face as unreadable as when she'd entered. She returned to the depot, logged supplies, checked manifests, and made her rounds as though nothing had happened. But beneath the surface, her dismissal had settled into her bones in a way that felt clarifying. The recruits had cut her belt, the Colonel had cut her purpose. Both thought they had ended something, both were wrong. The desert pressed on. At Fort Cinder, days bled into each other, heat, drills, sweat, dust. The depot's rhythm remained the same and moved inside it like clockwork. To anyone watching, she was the model of compliance. Paperwork immaculate, requisitions filed early, inventory checked twice. But invisibility was a kind of armor. She leaned into it. During breaks, she sat with a manual or clipboard, always positioned with a clear view of Bravo Company's training. She didn't stare. She glanced, observed, returned her eyes to the page. It was enough. Sergeant, their hand-to-hand instructor, taught with force. His voice carried across the square like a whip. Bigger, harder, don't let up. His movements were heavy, brutal, powered by raw strength. The recruits absorbed him like sponges. They his every swing, his every takedown. They became strong, fast, predictable. Especially, he relied on his right haymaker, throwing it with the confidence of someone who believed his fist could end any fight. But he left himself open, always. Another leaned too far when he blocked. Another staggered when forced backward. Watched filed away. The depot was her duty, but the training square, that was her study. At night in the small privacy of her barracks room, she brought out the belt. The leather pieces lay across her bed and tired. She threaded waxed cord through a heavy-duty needle, working it slowly through the cracks. Her hands didn't shake. They never did. The stitches weren't pretty. They were functional, hard, brutal. She used a saddle stitch, 2 threads interlocked, so that even if one strand broke, the other would hold. The seam formed a raised scar across the leather, ugly and undeniable. When she finished, she threaded the belt through her loops again. The scar tugged against the fabric of her fatigues, ugly, strong, permanent. She wore it the next day. Not for them, for herself. Because she understood something the recruits did not. A thing can be broken and mended, and in the mending it becomes something else. Something harder, something whole in a new way. Colonel convinced himself the problem was solved. She'd been chastised, reminded of her place. The incident would fade, the recruits would forget. But the memory nagged at him, her silence, her refusal to explain herself, her eyes that seemed to measure him more than his words had measured her. He pushed it down. He had bigger problems, schedules to maintain, instructors to keep on track, recruits to harden. And yet, when he saw her crossing the compound, belt stitched, head steady, he felt something shift in his chest. A question he couldn't quite articulate. "Who are you, specialist?" The recruits didn't forget. They laughed at first whenever she passed. Quiet clerk, ghost clerk, clerk. Liked to make a show of flexing when she was nearby, muttering something under his breath for his friends to snicker at. But the silence unsettled them more than retaliation ever could have. They had poked, mocked, broken something personal, and she had given them nothing. No complaint, no anger, no weakness. They didn't know what to do with that. Sometimes caught himself replaying the moment in his head. The way she had looked at him, just for a second before walking away. It hadn't been fear, it hadn't even been anger. It had been empty, like staring into a mirror that didn't reflect him back. He told himself it meant nothing, just a clerk, just silence. But at night, when the desert wind rattled against the thin walls of the barracks, he remembered, and the memory didn't make him laugh. Weeks passed, training escalated. The recruits were pushed harder, tested longer. The desert wrung the arrogance out of some, but not all. Remained in the background, invisible, filing requests and filling crates. But her eyes tracked more than supplies. She mapped the base. She knew where the military police patrolled, how long their rounds took, where the cameras swept, which corners remained blind. She memorized shift changes. She noted when the floodlights failed to cover the far edge of the motor pool. She didn't act on any of it, not yet, but she knew, and knowledge was its own form of weapon. One evening, as Bravo Company stumbled back from a long march, Sergeant caught sight of watching from the depot steps. He called out, his voice booming across the square. "Something you need, specialist." Shook her head. "Then stop wasting your time and theirs," barked. "This is what happens when you spend your life behind a desk. Don't be like that, recruits." The recruits laughed on cue. Turned, went back inside, and closed the door. Behind her, the laughter carried in the dry air until it thinned, frayed, and disappeared into the desert night. Why didn't she fight back? Why didn't she defend herself in the colonel's office? Why did she let the recruits laugh? The questions hung in the air, unspoken. The base accepted the simplest answer. She was nothing, a clerk, a non-factor. But knew the truth. Silence wasn't surrender. It was preparation. Patience. The belt around her waist wasn't a symbol of defeat, it was a promise. And when the time came, when the desert demanded proof of what she was, they would learn the truth the only way soldiers ever do. Through pain. Why did no one notice she was watching? From a distance looked like nothing more than a clerk on a break, a field manual balanced on her knee, her posture relaxed. But her eyes didn't linger on the page. They tracked the recruits, every movement, every strike, every flaw. The depot was her assignment, the training field was her classroom, and the recruits, they were the lessons. Sergeant barked commands, his voice carrying across the square like thunder. He was a slab of muscle and fury, teaching close-quarters combat as though war itself could be distilled into fists and brute force. Again, harder, don't stop until he's on the ground. The recruits obeyed. They lunged, swung, slammed each other into the dirt with the kind of aggression that made them feel unstoppable. Sweat gleamed on their arms, sand stuck to their faces. It was all theater. The loudest of them, the same one who had cut her belt, leaned into his haymaker every single time. She noted it, filed it away. Another recruit celebrated too early after blocking, his guard dropping for a split second. Another staggered when pushed backward, his balance weak on the retreat. Every mistake was a thread, and wove them into a map in her mind. She knew the desert's rhythms now, too. The wind that gusted hard around the mess hall just before dawn, rattling metal and masking sound. The camera sweeps that left blind corners for 3 seconds each cycle. The overlapping patrol routes that left 20 unguarded steps between 2 sectors. The others saw a base. She saw vulnerabilities. Because she had been underestimated, invisible, and invisibility was a weapon sharper than any blade. At night, in the silence of her barracks room, she returned to her belt. The scar of stitches cut across the dark leather, thick and ugly, raised like a wound that had healed badly but healed strong. Her hands traced the seam without hesitation. She had stitched it herself, not to restore it, not to erase the break, but to make it stronger. Every morning she threaded it through her loops again. The recruits noticed. Some laughed, smirked when he saw the scar of thread, muttering something about a broken belt for a broken soldier. But didn't flinch. The scar was the point. A belt that had been cut in half and made whole again wasn't weaker. It was proof. Proof that you could break something and it could still hold, stronger than before. Colonel, meanwhile, buried himself in schedules. He told himself the incident was over. The recruits were training harder, Bravo Company was on track. The evaluation cycle pressed forward. And yet he couldn't quite shake it. The image of standing in his office, silent under his words, not defensive, not broken, just still. He had dismissed her as washed up. He told himself that was the truth. But why, then, did her eyes linger in his thoughts when he tried to sleep? Why did he feel, beneath the scorn, a seed of unease? The recruits felt it too, though none would admit it aloud. Especially at night when the barracks fell quiet and the desert wind scraped against the walls, he remembered the look in her eyes when she picked up her ruined belt. Not fear, not anger, just emptiness. And in that emptiness, he had seen something he didn't understand. He told himself she was nothing, a clerk, a paper pusher, a belt with stitches, but the thought wouldn't let him go. Maybe that was why he doubled down, training harder, hitting harder, pushing louder, trying to prove, if only to himself, that her silence meant nothing. But silence, was never nothing. The days stretched on, sun scorching the square, nights freezing under stars that glittered sharp as glass. The depot remained orderly, her work flawless. She was the picture of discipline, invisible, forgettable. And yet beneath that cover she was learning, cataloging, waiting. She knew now how long it took a jeep to cross the compound. She knew which floodlights flickered before stabilizing. She knew that on Thursdays, one of the guards at the perimeter always lingered a little too long at the mess hall door, stretching a break. Details, always details. Because one day the desert would shift. The recruits would test themselves in the gauntlet, and when that happened, knew her silence would have to end. Sergeant liked to make her an example. Whenever he saw her watching, he called out across the square, his voice cutting through the noise. "Something you need, specialist." Always shook her head. Smirked, turning back to the recruits. "See that? That's what happens when you live behind a desk. Don't be like that." The recruits laughed on cue. Would turn away, return to her clipboard, her manifest sheets. On the outside, she was what he said, a clerk, a shadow. But inside, every insult was a stone, and stone by stone she was building something. The desert was patient, so was she. The recruits thought silence meant weakness. The colonel thought dismissal meant obedience. But silence was preparation, dismissal was freedom. And the belt around her waist wasn't a flaw, it was a promise. One day they would learn. Not through her words, through her hands. What happens when the system breaks, and the only answer left is the one nobody expects. The recruits had whispered about the gauntlet since the first week. The name itself carried weight. The gauntlet wasn't a drill or a sparring match. It was the test, a crucible built inside a cavernous hangar, a twisting maze of plywood walls and sheet metal corridors meant to mimic urban combat. Inside there were no safe corners. Every turn could be an ambush. Every door might be a trap. The rules were simple. 4 recruits entered. Their mission: neutralize the evaluator, a senior instructor role-playing as an enemy, and reach the exit. If they failed, if they were killed with training rounds or taken down, they would run it again, and again, until they passed, or until they broke. No one escaped the gauntlet unchanged. The day grew near, and the recruits grew restless. Whispers in the barracks, rumors of teams humiliated in seconds, of seasoned instructors dismantling cocky trainees without effort. Sergeant relished those whispers. "The gauntlet will eat you alive," he told them, packing like a predator in front of his platoon. "It will find your weakness, and it will not forgive it." Smirked, his confidence sharper than ever. To him and his clique, the gauntlet wasn't a trial. It was a stage, proof that they weren't just recruits but soldiers already forged. He laughed off the fear of the others, promised an easy victory. But the desert had a way of humbling men who thought themselves untouchable. The morning of the test, the hangar was alive with tension. The structure loomed in silence, its shadow falling across the sand like a threat. Inside, lights buzzed overhead, cameras mounted high in the rafters feeding every angle to the control room above. The air smelled of sweat, dust, and nerves. Colonel watched from the control booth, arms crossed, jaw tight. Every evaluation mattered, but this one mattered more. He couldn't afford disruption, couldn't afford failure. Bravo Company needed to pass. The schedule demanded it. And yet, as the recruits prepared to step inside, disaster struck. It happened fast. Was demonstrating a takedown, his movements quick, his body a machine honed by years of violence. But when his boot planted wrong, when his ankle twisted at an impossible angle, the crack echoed through the hangar like a gunshot. He went down, bellowing in pain, clutching at the joint. Medics rushed in, voices sharp, faces grim. Within minutes, the verdict was delivered: fracture, dislocation, weeks of recovery. The gauntlet had lost its predator. The control room descended into chaos. Officers muttered, staff scrambled. Postponement would wreck the entire training cycle. Flying in a replacement evaluator would take a week or more. Colonel's fury burned through the glass. "Unacceptable," he growled, his fist slamming onto the console. "We are not stopping. Find me an option." But there was no option. The system had broken. And into that silence a voice spoke, soft, almost too soft. "Sir, specialist says she can run it." The words hit the control room like a round detonating. Heads turned. A logistics clerk, a supply specialist, run the gauntlet. His eyes blazed. Say that again. The aide swallowed hard. She says she's a certified close-quarters combat instructor, Tier 1. A harsh laugh escaped before he could stop it. Tier 1, counting spare parts in a depot, he waved it off. Get her out of here, I don't have time for jokes. But the aide held his ground, desperation in his voice. Sir, we have no other option if she's telling the truth. Hesitated. The recruits were waiting. The cameras were rolling. The entire base had gathered to watch. His choices were humiliation now or humiliation later. His jaw clenched. Fine, send her in. But hear me clearly, if she embarrasses this command, she'll be reassigned to Antarctica before the week is out. The recruits were already buzzing when stepped onto the hangar floor. She wore the red uniform of the evaluator, her own leather belt fastened at her waist, the raised seam visible like a scar across her body. In her hand was a blue training pistol, holstered with casual ease. The silence that fell when they saw her was thick. Then came the snickers. This is our enemy, scoffed, grinning wide, the clerk. His teammates chuckled, slapping each other's shoulders, emboldened by disbelief. Ignored them. She walked to the entrance of the maze, her footsteps soft, her presence calm. She gave no speech, no threat, no performance, only a single instruction. The objective is unchanged. Subdue the evaluator, enter on my mark. And then she disappeared into the shadows. The recruits exchanged looks, sneered, easy win. But unease prickled beneath his bravado. In the control room, Colonel stood stiff, arms crossed, skepticism carved into his face. He expected disaster. On the floor, the recruits moved in formation, weapons raised, helmets gleaming, their voices sharp, confident. The comm crackled with his voice, steady, calm. Begin. The gauntlet swallowed them. The first corridor was empty. They advanced at the lead, eyes sharp, shoulders squared. At the four-way intersection, one of his men leaned into the corner. He saw nothing, took a step forward. From above, a shadow dropped. Landed silent as a falling blade, one precise strike to the back of the neck. The recruit crumpled before a sound escaped. She stripped his weapon, melted back into darkness. Miller status, hissed silence. The formation tightened. Unease bled into their confidence. They moved into a small room, backs to each other, rifles raised. The last man through the door didn't see the hand that snaked from the shadows, grabbing his barrel, yanking him forward. He stumbled and flowed around him, her arm coiling into a choke that ended in seconds. He tapped out, weapon clattering to the floor. Two down. The air grew thick. Their breaths echoed too loud in their helmets. Where is she? One recruit whispered, panic sharpening his tone. A scrape echoed from the far corridor. Both rifles swung toward it. A trick, a tossed pebble. She came from behind, a blur of precision, disarming one, striking his shoulder until his grip failed. Three down. And then there was only. The hallway stretched long and narrow before him. The exit glowed at the far end, light spilling through. And in that light she waited. Her stance was calm, silent, ready. Rage boiled through him. She was a clerk, a nothing. She couldn't beat him here. He charged. Shoulder low, body like a bull. His roar filled the hallway. But didn't move, not until the last second. She pivoted, her body flowing like water. Her hand guided his shoulder, turning his own momentum into a spiral. His weight carried him into the wall, face first, stunned and dazed. He tried to rise, legs trembling, but she was already there. A precise strike to his thigh, nerves collapsing, his body buckling. He hit the ground, disarmed, defeated. Stood above him, her breathing steady, her face calm. Not a drop of sweat betrayed her. The fight had lasted less than 90 seconds. The control room was silent. Officers, instructors, Colonel himself, all frozen, eyes locked on the screens. They had expected embarrassment. They had witnessed something else entirely. In controlled violence, precision beyond anything they taught, silence that had spoken louder than orders. Stood still, waiting for the call. And in that silence, the truth began to seep through the base like water through sand. The clerk wasn't what they thought. She never had been. Why did the silence feel heavier than the fight itself? The gauntlet had ended in 90 seconds, but the hangar still vibrated with the echo of it. 4 recruits, brash, loud, so certain of their strength, now sat on the ground, humiliated, disarmed, breathing hard. And above them stood the woman they had mocked, her red uniform stark against the shadows, her belt cinched at her waist. Didn't gloat, she didn't speak. She didn't even look at them for long. She simply retrieved their weapons, set them neatly aside, and waited for the official call. End exercise, Colonel's voice finally crackled through the comms, rougher than he'd intended. Evaluator is victorious. The words felt inadequate. Down on the hangar floor, recruits waiting their turn shifted uneasily. They had heard everything through the comms, watched team crumble, seen the blur of motion on the monitors. What they'd mocked as silence now pressed on them like a weight. Stumbled out last, his helmet in his hands, his face pale and tight. His swagger was gone, his smirk erased. He avoided every eye. The laughter that had once trailed across the compound had evaporated. In its place was something quieter, sharper, whispers edged with awe. The supply clerk wasn't a joke anymore. She was something else entirely. Walked through them without a word, returning the evaluator's gear to a stunned NCO whose hands trembled as he took it. Outside, the desert heat wrapped around her like it always did, dry, suffocating, endless. She didn't rush. She didn't linger. She simply made her way back to the depot as though nothing had happened. But nothing at Fort Cinder would ever be the same. In the control room, no one moved at first. Colonel stared at the monitor long after his figure had disappeared. His mouth was dry, his chest tight. He replayed the words he'd spoken to her in his office, washed up, clerk problem, and every syllable burned now with shame. He hadn't seen her for what she was. He hadn't even looked. He dismissed her as irrelevant, invisible, but the truth was undeniable. This wasn't just competence. It wasn't even excellence. It was mastery. She hadn't overpowered them. She hadn't bullied her way through. She had dismantled them piece by piece with a calm that bordered on terrifying. Had seen many soldiers in his career, brilliant tacticians, hard fighters, ruthless leaders. But what he had witnessed in that hangar was different. It wasn't just training. It was instinct. Something honed far beyond Fort Cinder's reach. He swallowed hard, his pride cracking under the weight of realization. What had the army sent him? The news spread faster than orders ever could. By evening, every barracks whispered her name. The recruits no longer joked when she passed. Conversations hushed. Eyes followed her. Some held awe, some held fear, but none held mockery. Once their alpha had shrunk into silence. The memory of her pivot, the disorienting spiral that had thrown him into the wall, replayed in his head in endless loops. At night, he swore he could still feel the press of her knee against his thigh, the precise strike that had sent his body collapsing. He had thought he was a predator. He had learned he was prey. And he hated her for it. But beneath that hatred was something more dangerous: respect. Noticed the shift but didn't feed it. She returned to her depot, her manifests, her quiet routine. She wore her belt each morning, the raised seam tugging across her waist, an unspoken reminder of what she carried. She neither sought their eyes nor avoided them. She neither welcomed their whispers nor silenced them. She was what she had always been, still, efficient, unreadable. But silence had changed shape. It was no longer invisibility. It was presence. Colonel approached her the next day. He didn't know what he meant to say until he was standing in front of her, the weight of his rank heavy on his shoulders. She turned when he called her name, her face neutral, eyes steady. That was an impressive demonstration, he said finally, the words stiff, unpracticed. "I followed the parameters, sir," replied. "Calm, factual, nothing more." "Studied her? Your file says you were support, logistics, Fort." "Yes, sir, the file is accurate." But something in her eyes, something cold, something controlled, told him the file was only a fraction of the truth. He pressed. "Support elements don't usually produce instructors of your caliber." Her silence answered for her. A wall, not of weakness but of discipline. She gave him nothing. And for the first time in his career, Colonel felt the uncomfortable sensation of being the lesser in the conversation. That night the desert wind howled around the barracks, rattling tin and metal like loose bones. Inside, the recruits lay restless. Some whispered about her, others tried to dismiss it, but none of them slept easily. Because every soldier understood one truth, even if they didn't say it aloud: strength wasn't always loud. Sometimes strength was silent. Sometimes it waited. And sometimes it struck so fast, so precise, that you never even saw it coming. Sat alone in her room, the belt coiled beside her. She traced the scar of stitches with her thumb, feeling the raised thread rough against her skin. It wasn't pretty, but it was strong. And she thought of the recruits, of the colonel, of the way the desert stripped everyone down to the bone. The belt wasn't a relic, it wasn't weakness, it was truth. That you could cut something in half, break it, scar it, and it would still hold. Sometimes stronger than before. Fort Cinder had changed, the recruits had changed, even the colonel had changed. But she remained silent. And in that silence, the base began to understand. Silence wasn't surrender. It was command. Why did victory feel more dangerous than defeat? The gauntlet had ended, but its shadow stretched far beyond the hangar walls. The recruits filed back to their barracks that night with shoulders hunched, voices hushed, laughter gone. The silence across Fort Cinder wasn't discipline. It was fear. Not fear of the colonel, not fear of the instructors, fear of her. Colonel stood in the control room long after everyone else had left. The hangar lights buzzed. The monitors still glowed, replaying frozen frames of the fight, pivoting, redirecting charge into the wall. Her movements replayed in endless loops, as if the cameras themselves couldn't believe what they'd captured. He had spent his career building order from chaos. He had seen war, seen soldiers break, seen them rise again. But this was something else. He thought of his words to her in his office. "Clerk, washed up, stay out of the way." Each one now echoed back at him like a taunt. He had misjudged her, utterly. And worse, he had no idea who she really was. The next morning, the desert sun rose hard and white over the compound. Recruits dragged themselves to formation, but the air was different. Where once there had been bravado, now there was restraint. Where there had been mockery, now there was watchfulness. When passed on her way to the depot, the crowd parted, not out of courtesy, out of instinct. They didn't speak to her, they didn't challenge her, they didn't laugh. She didn't need words to command them. Her silence spoke louder than anything Sargent ever bellowed. Felt it most of all. His pride was a hollow thing now. His name whispered not as a leader but as a warning. He still saw her in his mind, standing calm, waiting, dismantling him with a grace that had humiliated him more deeply than 1,000 insults ever could. He wanted to hate her, but hate was a fire, and fire couldn't survive in the vacuum of her silence. So all that remained was respect, bitter, unwanted, but respect nonetheless. Returned to her depot, her paperwork, her crates, her belt and stitched, wrapped firmly around her waist. She made no demands. She sought no recognition. She remained who she had always been, quiet, precise, efficient. But Fort Cinder wasn't the same. The desert had shifted. Her silence was no longer invisible. It was gravity. Colonel tried to move on, but he couldn't. The questions gnawed at him. What kind of soldier dismantled 4 recruits in under 90 seconds without breaking a sweat? What kind of clerk knew how to redirect force with such precision, to choke a man unconscious with such economy of motion? He had seen special operators move like that once or twice in shadowed briefings in classified footage, but they were the rarest of the rare. And's file said logistics. He didn't believe in ghosts, but she was making him wonder. That evening he sat in his office, the desert wind rattling against the windows, her file spread across his desk once again. He read the same lines he'd memorized. Fort, Joint Special Operations Command Support Element, Transfer, no commendations. It was a ghost of a career, too clean, too vague, too empty. He picked up the phone, called contacts at the Pentagon. The responses were polite but clipped, records restructured, no details available. Not authorized, one voice told him, flat as a locked door. The more he pushed, the colder the trail grew. And the more he realized someone wanted hidden. That night he dreamed of her. Not of her fight in the gauntlet, but of her silence in his office weeks earlier, when she had stood perfectly calm while he tried to strip her down with words. He had thought she was passive, weak. But now he understood. She hadn't been avoiding confrontation. She had been weighing him, measuring him, and finding him wanting. The thought made his chest tighten in a way that felt uncomfortably close to fear. The base adjusted to the new reality. Recruits gave her distance. Instructors avoided mentioning her at all. Even the MPs, who prided themselves on detachment, glanced at her with a flicker of unease when she crossed their path. It wasn't that she had become larger, louder, more forceful. It was that she hadn't. She was exactly the same. And that stillness once mocked was now terrifying. Colonel knew he couldn't leave it there. The Army had sent him a puzzle, and puzzles carried risk. If she was what he suspected, if she wasn't what her file claimed, then Fort Cinder was housing something dangerous, something unpredictable. He told himself it was about security, about the safety of his command, about the order he'd sworn to uphold. But beneath those justifications, there was another truth he wouldn't admit. His pride had been cut in half, stitched back together with scars that wouldn't fade. He needed to know who really was. And there was only one way to find out. He had to test her. So he began to plan, not a routine evaluation, not another gauntlet, something harder, something designed not to be passed. An impossible test. Because only when a person was pushed beyond their limits did their true self emerge. And he needed to see hers. Outside, the desert night stretched wide and endless. Stars burned like holes in the sky, sharp and cold. The compound slept fitfully, recruits turning in their bunks, officers buried in reports, engines ticking cool in the motor pool. Sat alone in her room, the belt coiled beside her, her eyes fixed on the seam of stitches. The scar was ugly, raised, uneven. But it held. And so did she. She didn't know yet what the colonel was planning. She didn't know the impossible test waiting in the shadows. But she didn't need to. Because the truth about silence was simple. It was patient. And patience never lost. What kind of soldier do you become when failure is the only option? Colonel stared at the glowing map of Fort Cinder on his office wall, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. He had spent the night awake, drawing lines, erasing them, redrawing. The gauntlet had shown him something extraordinary, too extraordinary. Now he needed to know how far it went. He called her into his office the next morning. The desert light bled through the blinds, painting harsh stripes across his polished desk. Stepped in exactly on time, closing the door behind her with the same calm precision she did everything. She stood at ease, hands clasped loosely behind her back, her face unreadable. But saw it differently now. He no longer mistook it for passivity. He knew it for what it was, coiled readiness. "I have a task for you," he said, his voice low, deliberate. Her eyes flicked once to the map glowing behind him, then back to his. "Sir, at 2200 hours tonight this base will go to full alert, a simulated active threat scenario." He tapped the map. "Your objective will be to infiltrate the Command Operations Center, gain access to my terminal, retrieve a dummy file, Project Chimera, place it on this." He slid a black USB stick across the desk. It stopped at the edge of her fingers. "And then exfiltrate without being detected." His words hung in the air like a death sentence. "The entire MP detachment will be hunting you," continued. "Every sensor, every camera, every guard will be at maximum readiness. If you are detected, the test ends immediately. You are not authorized to engage personnel. This is stealth only." Glanced at the USB stick, picked it up, weighed it in her palm as though testing the weight of the challenge itself. "Understood," she said. Searched her face for hesitation. He found none. "You should know," he added, his tone sharp. "No one has ever succeeded in breaching the COC under full alert. It's designed to be impossible." His reply was simple: "Then I'll fail efficiently." And that was all. She turned, executed a perfect about-face, and left. Stared at the closed door, his pulse thrumming in his throat. Why did her words not sound like submission? Why did they sound like a promise? The hours crawled. Recruits moved through drills, instructors barked orders, the desert wind rattled sheet metal like bones. But a current ran beneath it all, an invisible thread pulling with every tick of the clock. By dusk, the base was restless. No one knew why the alert had been scheduled. Rumors spread, half-whispers of an inspection, a drill, a test. Only two people knew the truth. At 2150 hours stood in the shadow of the S4 depot. She wore her standard fatigues. No special gear. No rifle, no pack, no tools. Just her stitched belt, the seam pulling taut at her waist. The USB stick sat cool in her palm. She closed her fingers around it. At 2200 hours sharp, the sirens wailed. Floodlights roared to life, casting the compound in harsh white beams. Guards sprinted to posts, jeeps roared across gravel, radios crackled with frantic voices. The base became a hive of noise and movement. The hunt had begun. In the Command Operations Center, the control room was alive with tension. Monitors flickered with feeds from every corner of the compound. Red dots marked patrols. Cameras cycled every few seconds. "Where is she?" demanded. "Still no visual, sir," the security chief replied. "She hasn't left S4 sector." "She's had 10 minutes. She should moved by now." Leaned over the monitors, scanning the feeds, his jaw clenched. And then a thought crept in, cold and unsettling. What if she wasn't moving because she didn't need to? In the shadows behind the depot, waited. The first minutes of an alert were chaos. Patrols scrambled, overlapping in predictable loops. Guards sprinted to pre-planned posts. The cameras panned in perfect rhythm. Patterns, always patterns. She counted silently. 5 minutes, 6, 7. The chaos began to settle, movement smoothing into routine. That was when she moved. Not across open ground. Not into the beams of the floodlights. She flowed through shadows, each step masked by the roar of a Jeep engine, the shout of a sergeant, the grinding whine of a generator kicking to life. Every sound became her cover, every distraction her ally. At the communications array, she found the rusted maintenance grate she'd noted weeks ago. 2 bolts, corroded and weak. She pulled the USB from her pocket, used its edge like a screwdriver, twisted. Metal squealed softly, and then the grate gave way. She slipped inside, pulling it shut behind her. Darkness swallowed her. Pipes, conduits, dust. The tunnels beneath the base weren't on any schematic the colonel had flashed on his wall, but knew them. She had mapped them in her head long before he thought to test her. Above her the search raged. Guards shouted. Radios crackled. Below she moved like water through stone. 20 minutes, sir, the security chief reported, sweat running down his temple. Still no sign. His fingers drummed against the console, his gut twisted. She hasn't vanished. Nobody vanishes. But even as he said it, his certainty faltered. He remembered the gauntlet 90 seconds, 4 recruits dismantled. He remembered her silence in his office, the way she had given him nothing, as if nothing he said mattered. And now, as the cameras fed him only emptiness, he realized a terrifying possibility. Maybe she wasn't playing his game at all. Maybe she was playing her own. In the tunnels, moved without hesitation. She counted her steps, the vibrations above her marking guard rotations. She paused only to listen, calibrating her sense of space. Left turn 20 paces, ladder vent. She climbed, her movements silent, the dust clinging to her fatigues. At the top, she pushed carefully against the vent cover. It gave with barely a sound. She slipped out into a storage room beneath the command center itself. She had bypassed everything. The patrols, the cameras, the guards. The impossible task was already behind her. Now came the choice. Colonel leaned over the monitors, eyes scanning, his frustration mounting. 30 minutes, the chief said, his voice tight. We should seen her by now. It doesn't make sense, muttered. She can't have just disappeared. But even as the words left him, dread coiled in his gut. Because deep down he knew. She hadn't failed. She was already inside. What truth do you leave behind when silence is no longer enough? The tunnels had carried her farther than the colonel ever imagined. Beneath the chaos of boots pounding gravel, beneath the radios buzzing, beneath the floodlights burning across the desert, moved unseen. She emerged through a vent into a forgotten storage room on the command operations center. The walls smelled of dust and old paint. No cameras, no guards, no attention. She waited there still as stone, listening. Above her, footsteps marched in steady rhythm. Voices echoed, muffled, patrol rotations. She had studied them for weeks. She knew the gaps. When the hall outside fell silent, she slipped out. Her boots made no sound on the floor. She climbed the stairwell, each step measured, breath steady. At the top, the corridor stretched long and dim, lined with closed doors. At the far end, 2 MPs stood guard outside the colonel's office. Their rifles rested in ready position, eyes forward. But wasn't going through the door. She turned instead into the office next to it, the XO's. Empty, as expected. The officer who worked there was in the command room, glued to the monitors. The lock was a joke. A paper clip, straightened between her fingers, clicked it open in seconds. Inside, the office was dark. She crossed to the vent on the wall, unscrewed its cover with quick, practiced motions, and slipped inside. The duct was narrow, dust clinging to her fatigues, but she didn't hesitate. She crawled forward, the sound of her movement swallowed by the hum of the building. Moments later, she dropped silently into Colonel's office. The room was empty, lit only by the pale glow of the computer monitor on the desk. The sirens still blared outside, the base alive with the chaos of an alert. But here, in the heart of command, stood in stillness. She crossed to the desk, inserted the USB stick, and located the dummy file, Project Chimera. A few keystrokes, a quiet chime, transfer complete. Objective achieved. But she wasn't done. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, entering a string of numbers and letters, clearance codes no one on this base should have had. Layers of security peeled away under her hands. The machine yielded. Her file opened, and she left it there, glowing on the colonel's screen. Specialist, last assignment, Operational Detachment Sigma, call sign Nix. Redactions covered most of it. Thick black bars blotting out missions, locations, names. But what remained was enough. Enough to tell a story. Sabotage, unconventional warfare, high-value extractions, operations buried so deep they weren't supposed to exist. and one line that explained everything. During the infiltration of REDACTED, Operator Nix was separated from her team. Pursued by hostile forces, her primary gear destroyed, she neutralized 3 armed combatants using only an improvised flail fashioned from her leather duty belt. Her actions ensured the survival of her team and mission success. The belt, the same one had cut, the same one she had stitched back together, it wasn't a relic, it wasn't weakness, it was proof. A battle honor carried not for utility but for memory. Her silence hadn't been surrender, it had been survival. Removed the USB stick and set it neatly in the center of his desk. She left the file open on his monitor, its words burning like a brand in the dim office. And then she slipped back into the duct. When the MPs outside shifted their weight, they never heard her. When the colonel barked orders in the command room, he never knew she was a breath away. She moved through the vents like smoke, vanishing back into the tunnels. The base above raged with motion, the cameras scanned, the guards shouted, but was already gone. 30 minutes after the alert began, the security chief stood stiff in the command room, sweat dripping from his brow. "No sign, sir," he reported. "It's like she vanished." His jaw tightened. No one vanishes, no one. But as he stared at the monitors, he felt it in his bones. She hadn't failed. She had succeeded so perfectly, she had erased herself from the system. The dread that had been gnawing at him finally took shape. She wasn't playing his test, she was proving a point. And that point terrified him. "Lock down my office," snapped suddenly. "4-man team, breach it now." The MPs scrambled, weapons ready, stacking outside his door. At his command, they rammed it open, splintering the frame. "Clear," one shouted seconds later. "Office secure, no sign of the target." Strode down the hall, his boots heavy, his pulse hammering. When he stepped into his office, his breath caught. The room was pristine, silent, empty, except for the USB stick on his desk, and the monitor glowing with a file that should not exist. His eyes locked on the name. Nix, a name he had heard in whispers, in classified briefings spoken only in shadowed corners, a name associated with missions no one admitted happened. Nix, the goddess of night. And now the woman counting crates at his depot. His hands trembled as he read the commendation about the belt, the survival, the fight, the scar. It struck him like a blow. The recruits had cut her belt and laughed. He had called her weak and dismissed her. But the truth had been there all along, around her waist, stitched, and a symbol of survival they were too blind to see. Colonel stepped back from the monitor, his chest rising and falling in sharp breaths. He had set her an impossible test. She had passed without leaving a trace, and in doing so, she had revealed exactly what she wanted him to know. Not everything, not the whole truth, just enough. Enough to remind him that he had no power here, that she had chosen silence, and that silence was strength. Outside, the desert wind howled. The alert sirens wailed. Floodlights carved the compound into shards of light and shadow. And somewhere in those shadows, moved unseen, belt tight at her waist, her face calm, her silence absolute. She had left the colonel with answers, and with questions he wasn't ready to face. Because the truth was simple. Sometimes silence doesn't hide. Sometimes silence reveals.